Okay, hello everybody. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm incredibly excited to be joined today by Ashley Luskey. She's the Assistant Director at the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, and she's had past lives as Park Ranger at Richmond National Battlefield, so she's been around and she knows all kinds of really exciting things. And she's here to talk to us today about farmsteads on the Gettysburg battlefield, and specifically the medical treatment that was given at those places after the Battle of Gettysburg. So that's going to be a good time. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Always a pleasure. And it's always a pleasure to have you watching us. Thanks so much for tuning in. Really appreciate it, or listening as the case may be. If you like this, go ahead and like the video, or consider sharing it or sending it to a friend of yours that you know will like it. And if you really like it, maybe you would consider becoming a member to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Your memberships are what allow us to continue doing things like this. They really support this sort of programming, and we've been incredibly blessed by your generosity during this time when our doors are closed. So if you haven't become a member, please consider doing so. If you have become a member, perhaps another donation. A number of our members have given us additional donations, and again, we're incredibly thankful. We're so blessed to have such an incredible group of members and generous audience members like yourself tuning in. So thank you so much for all of that. We really appreciate it. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So this originally, Ashley, had a life as a tour, I believe, that you gave at a previous Civil War Institute conference. And by the way, if you haven't heard of the Civil War Institute, or especially their summer conference, and you're watching this video, you'd probably love it. So I'd encourage you to Google Civil War Institute Summer Conference, and you'll pull up all kinds of great information about that. But I think this had its original life was for that. Is that correct?
Yes, so this was for a tour that I originally gave 2 summers ago about embattled civilians of Gettysburg, where I took a bunch of people out. I believe it was a 4-hour tour, so a half-day tour. We do 3
Yeah,
days.
they mean business at the Civil War Institute.
We do, and this wasn't the most intense of any of the tours too. This was the half-day tours are one of 3 days of tours that we do. We do a full day of tours on the Monday of the conference week, and then we do a half day of tours on the Tuesday morning. And then we have started doing Saturday evening tours of the battlefield as well, to complement the various lectures and small group discussions that we do at the conference. So this was a half-day tour, and it basically originated out of, many of our tours do focus, there's a obvious desire for tours of the battlefield, following particular units, following particular soldiers, investigating specific themes of, courage or cowardice or honor or things like that in battle at Gettysburg. And it had always been an interest of mine to look at the civilian part of the story. You see all these beautiful farmsteads, beautiful bank barns dotting the landscape of the Gettysburg battlefield. And to me, I always wondered, well, who exactly lived there in these places during the battle? Where did they go? What happened to them? I knew a bunch of names, of course. You see the signs out in front of the houses all the time. But I really wanted to delve deeper into that and kind of look at the lived realities of these individuals. And what I ended up finding was really a rich texture of stories and of individual experiences. There were, of course, some common themes that I unearthed that I hope we'll get to talk about today, but also some very diverse, individualized experiences that were surprising to me to uncover, that kind of deviated from those themes. And so that's what kind of bound the tour together, was looking at kind of the shared experiences, but looking at also the variances that defined these people's lives, who went through, not only 3 days of intense battle and uncertainty and horror and bloodshed, but also they had to deal with the aftermath as well, and looking at how they did that. So that was kind of the genesis.
Which it's worth noting, I think, that aftermath that you talk about went on, I believe, for months. I mean, it was not a short amount of time.
Yes. And I mean, even if you wanted to talk about the full aftermath, you could say it went on for years too, for some of these families. But surely, yeah, for the first 3, 4, 5 months, the town was just one vast hospital. The sights and smells and sounds are unimaginable to us today, to contemplate what that was like. And for these people trying to rebuild and come to terms with all of that, to try to deal with all of the sick and the wounded men, dead animals on their doorsteps, livelihoods that were completely destroyed, was something that I think is unfathomable to us today, because we've never luckily had to deal with that kind of intensity before. But I also found, in these stories, there were examples of individuals who were able to surprisingly benefit off of some of the destruction, not necessarily in a selfish or ghoulish way, but they were able to make the best out of their circumstances and turn things around in kind of surprising ways. And I found that to be some of the most, compelling evidence of all. I kind of went into this, wondering, all right, what was kind of the texture of life for these individuals living on the border between the North and the South during the war? And for civilians in Gettysburg, they lived an experience that was very different from most people in the North. Border towns had their own sets of challenges. They had their own diverse residents. They had complications. They had opportunities for interactions with Southerners, certainly commercial interactions, but they also had fears and uncertainties. So there was a certain tenuous reality to these people's lives. For white residents of Gettysburg, they were told numerous times during the war by their governor, oh, the rebels are coming, they're invading, there's going to be a battle here, time to pack up and leave, harvest your crops, get out of town. This happened numerous times between 1862 and 1864. And certainly there were cavalry raids in the area during that time, and the burning of Chambersburg in 1864 was a reality. But so many times these warnings, these, red flags, they didn't really play out. And so when the battle occurred, it finally came here in July of 1863, there were a bunch of white individuals who said, wow, I didn't think it was actually going to happen this time. I mean, some harvested their crops and left town. They packed up their valuables. They fled to Lancaster, to York, to, Harrisburg, anywhere they could get to. But there are other people who were kind of, caught in their tracks because they didn't, believe that this was actually happening. Another thing, obviously, for African Americans, this is an extremely tenuous and dangerous position for them to be living in a border town. Gettysburg has about 200 African American residents in 1863. And numerous times during the war, there were Confederate raiding parties that slipped over the border. They kidnapped some of these African Americans. They would take them into slavery. Some of these African Americans had escaped slavery, and they'd come across into Pennsylvania, some through the Underground Railroad networks, and they had established a new life for themselves. And so every time they heard the alarm coming that the rebel forces were coming, this was terrifying. I mean, they could have their children ripped out from under them. They themselves could be bought, and taken back into slavery. So this meant an entirely different set of circumstances for the Black population of Gettysburg. And then, of course, you have, as I mentioned, these white families who, because they're living in a border town, they do have commercial interactions with the South. And you have divided families in Gettysburg. The Culp family, of course, being perhaps one of the most well-known, where you have brothers who, one fights for the North, one fights for the South. The Confederate brother ends up dying on Culp's Hill, his uncle's farm. That was a common story as well. The Wentz family that lived along the Emmetsburg Road was another family that experienced that. The parents remained loyal to the North. The son went off and fought with the Confederate Army. He ends up fighting, I believe, with E.P. Alexander's artillery near his family farm at Gettysburg. So you have that reality. And then, as I said, you have different people making sense of the battle and the aftermath in different ways, people finding opportunities to pick up the pieces and perhaps do a little bit better than they'd been doing before. You have people whose entire livelihoods were destroyed. This was a grand tragedy for them, and they never really recovered. Some of them lost family members. Some of them lost their entire, farm, their houses, their, financial well-being. And the interesting thing about it was I went in thinking, well, surely the poorer members of town, these poor farm families, they probably ended up in the absolute worst situation. The wealthier members came out on top. African Americans probably fared by far the worst. Women probably suffered by far the worst. And while there were certainly instances of that being the case, it wasn't always true. There were members of poor farming families who were quite enterprising and who came out better than some of the wealthier families. There were African Americans who ended up doing better after the battle and the destruction than they had been doing before. There were women who had displayed surprising strength and came out profiting, in fact, off of the battle and the destruction in ways that some of the male, farm holders did not. So I found all of these complexities, things that really complicated maybe my initial impressions of civilians kind of having maybe not a monolithic experience, but kind of a uniform experience. And my research really complicated that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something, and in some ways, like when you think about it, it shouldn't surprise you, but it always somehow does, that everyone's experience is just a little bit different. It doesn't follow these neat patterns that we think that it should follow, but somehow it always does. It does surprise us, but
Sure.
we find that as well, when, at least specifically, when comparing, sort of the situation, in the aftermath of various different battles, what the medical care situation was. And there's always these unique challenges with battle X, Y, or Z, because it's always just a little bit different. Sometimes it's there's not enough supplies. Sometimes they're so far away from any sort of shelter. Sometimes hospitals get captured because they didn't expect the battle to move as quickly as it does. So there are all these various circumstances. And then the other thing I wanted to note, this conversation is, of special interest to us, because we love talking about the civilian experience after battles, often because A, not a lot of people talk about it, and B, one of our 3 sites is the Pry House Field Hospital Museum. So again, a little bit different than what we're going to be talking about today, but a similar style thing where, the armies come and suddenly their property is abruptly a hospital. And our viewers will probably be familiar with that story. But so this is kind of the Pry family story, but transposed onto another battlefield. Let's go ahead and get specific here. Why don't we highlight a couple of these cases that you alluded to? Take it wherever you want it to go, Ashley.
Sure. So one of the individuals who I find of having a very interesting story, a tragic story, and maybe an unsurprising story considering his background, is George Rose of the Rose Farm. And if you're not familiar exactly where that is, the Rose Farm is this beautiful stone house that's located, it's set back from the Embattled Road. George Rose owned the wheat field. He owned the portion of woodline and farmland where the famous Alexander Gardner photos were taken of the bloated dead bodies with the cracked rocks in the background that William Frasnito has done so much great research into identifying exactly where those photographs were taken. George Rose was, by all accounts, a very wealthy individual. Before the Civil War, he had purchased this property and had this beautiful, I believe, 22-room manor house, stone house, outbuildings, huge amount of acreage. He lived on the southern portion of the battlefield, or what would become the battlefield, which is generally where the poorer families lived because the farmland was rockier. It wasn't necessarily, great for growing a lot of crops. But George Rose had invested in this property. He was a butcher, And he had actually purchased this property to use as a summer retreat. This was his vacation home before Gettysburg. And he lived most of the time in Philadelphia. So he spent very little time actually on this property before the battle came. But he rented out his property to his brother John, who was a tenant. There was another tenant who was living there as well, at least one other tenant, which is a common theme that you find. A lot of tenants were actually residing at these properties during the time of the battle. The owners lived someplace else in some other city. So John Rose was there at the time of the battle with this other tenant. And the sheer swath of destruction, human bodies, dead horses, equipment strewn all over the property at the end of the battle just absolutely destroyed that property. There were, I believe, 400 dead bodies that John Rose found when he came back to the property after fleeing, including bodies in his well. So the water source had been polluted. And he had to find a way to deal with these bodies, to try and clean up the mess. He had a farm to run. He had to get back to reality. He was leasing this property from his brother. So all kinds of complications that he had to go through and that this other tenant went through. And he, like many of the tenants and a lot of the owners of these farms, tried to file through the Border Claims Commission for payment. Basically remunerations for damage done to the property during the battle.
And can I ask a quick question about that? Yeah. That's not an uncommon thing for property owners on many Civil War battles, battlefields. In your research, was there a common theme? Were most people successful in getting those claims, or was there a total, up and, some people were, some weren't? What was the success rate, would you say?
Yeah, it's a good question. From what I've found, and this not only applies to the border claims here, but also in the Southern Claims Commission research that I did while working in Richmond, that it was very rare that a person would ever get the full amount that they filed for. And of course, I think a lot of people were stretching the numbers a little bit just to try and recoup even more of their losses. But it was rare that they would get the full amount. It was rare that they would even get close to the full amount. Most people, if they got anything, got a paltry amount. And part of that is due to the fact that these claims were to be paid specifically for damages incurred by the federal army. And so it's very difficult to prove that your fence line was destroyed by federal artillery and not by Confederates, that your well was polluted only by federal bodies, not by Confederates. And so that's what makes this so complicated. And of course, with all the government red tape, they're very stringent and strict about who actually gets this money. So very few people actually get sizable sums out of this. And George Rose was one of them. John Rose was one of them as well, just to get a little bit of money, mostly because almost all the damages were in fact, done by Confederates. Most of those dead were Confederate dead on the property, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, George Rose, basically after the battle, he realizes that his finances are seriously in trouble. His farm has been so destroyed. John Rose can't really operate it as a farm anymore. And so George tries to put the farm up for sale numerous times. It's on the market. You see ads in the local newspapers years and years and years, him trying to make this place seem like this glorious farm retreat, this beautiful place to live. In fact, it was still severely pockmarked from the battle. And he eventually will sell it. I'm not sure if it was at public auction or a neighbor. It might have been a neighbor who purchased it first. The neighbor buys it, realizes, ooh, this is in much tougher shape than we thought. He sells it back to George. George tries to sell it again. A person buys it, immediately sells it back. George has all of these creditors after him. He's desperately bankrupt. His, summer retreat is basically destroying his life at this point. He finally does get rid of it, but he is so destitute that he ends up basically as kind of a lowly manual laborer in Philadelphia by the time he dies. Not nearly the lifestyle he had imagined for himself. Not nearly what he had worked his entire life for, being this independent, wealthy farmer, the glorious Gettysburg summer retreat, an independent laborer. He was working for the man in the end, because the battle had destroyed him. So he's an example of, the wealthy white man who you would think would get off, pretty easy. They'd suffer, but not nearly as much as some of the poorer people. And really, it absolutely destroys George Rose and his family. So I found him to be particularly compelling. Another a family that I found really interesting, kind of on the other side of things, was the Kadori family. The Kadoris, of course, lived in the brick house with the big red barn, very iconic, along the Embattled Road, kind of right in the middle of Pickett's Charge. And the Kadoris, Nicholas and George and Anthony, had migrated from France when they were very young, when they were 19, 20 years old. They'd come over to Gettysburg. They had bought a couple of properties in town on York Street. Nicholas Kadori was very wary of putting money in banks. He really didn't trust banks, so instead he invested all of his money in land. And he is a butcher by trade. He has a butcher shop in town, and butcher shops are eventually outlawed in Gettysburg, in the borough itself, and so he's forced to move his butcher shop out of the town, which is why he purchases this big tract of land on the Embattled Road, known as the Kadori Farm as we know it today. And he will eventually own about 350 acres of land by the time that the battle arrives. He just sinks all of his money into land. He will own all of the land basically headed back to where the Virginia monument is, along with his huge swath, around the current farmstead. And during the battle itself, Nicholas and Anthony, they stay in Gettysburg. I believe Nicholas flees to the York Street home, to the basement of it, and that's where he is during the battle. Anthony stays in the house with his daughter, Catherine, who is 9 months pregnant with twins at the time. During the battle, she'll actually give birth to those twins on July 8th. So talk about a warrior. And he is basically in charge of trying to, protect the farm during the battle. And the night before the battle opens, the Vermont Brigade under George Standard arrives near the property. They start taking down fence lines. They start kind of digging, an encampment for themselves that night. And Anthony runs out and he waves his hands and he says, can't you, try to move around my property rather than, cutting down my fences and, destroying my wheat and everything. And basically the commander says to his men, just, keep on marching, doing what you're doing.
Well, and that's the dilemma for so many civilians about, should they flee or try and stay? Because, if you flee, who knows what's going to happen to your property. But even though staying might make you psychologically feel a little better, who knows what's going to happen to your property if you stay too. And here's a great example of, we're staying, I'm sure it felt good to feel like maybe you had a little bit of control, but the Union Army wants to take down some fences and dig around. That's what they're going to do.
Right. Yeah. And, again, he thought, staying in the house, he could maybe offer a little protection, of course, not just to his property, but also to his very pregnant daughter, whose husband was off fighting with a Pennsylvania unit at the time. Of course, the Kadori Farm is the center of two huge attacks by the Confederates, July 2nd and July 3rd. So the place is pretty beaten up after the battle. Unlike George Rose, however, Nicholas Kadori actually emerges kind of victorious after the battle because some of his neighbors don't fare so well. The Bliss family, who had a farm just across the Embattled Road that was used as a sharpshooter's hideout, especially during Pickett's Charge, the Bliss family loses a significant amount of their property as well as their barn, and I'm not sure if it was their house and their barn that burned during the battle, but at least one of them did. And so the Blisses were forced to sell and leave Gettysburg. And who was right there to purchase their land? Nicholas Kadori. He eventually continues to buy more land from some of the other people in the area who were forced to leave because of the destruction. And so he ends up adding even more acreage to his property. He buys some more acreage kind of on the other side of Gettysburg. So he's doing pretty well for himself after the battle. And things didn't go so well for his brother George, I should say. George is interesting because he is one of 9 white males who was actually captured by the Confederate Army. during the battle. He's returning from Baltimore, trying to sell a carriage. Again, these commercial interactions that were ongoing on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. He's wearing his son's Union Army jacket. His son was in the Army. And I'm not sure, what compelled him to do that. Maybe he thought it would protect him, from Union soldiers mistaking him. He ran into Confederate cavalry. He was captured. He was taken south. He was actually put into Libby Prison in Richmond, transferred to Salisbury Prison in North Carolina. And he grew so sick that when he was finally discharged in March of 1865, he comes back to Gettysburg. He has horrible pneumonia and he dies 3 days later. So that was his Civil War experience. His brother Nicholas, though, he still continues to buy up more land. He's still doing well. He expands his farm. He's doing pretty well for himself until one unfortunate day in, I believe, 1878, when he is out trying to mow some of his hay across the Embattled Road, kind of where the Bliss farm is. He has some young colts that are tied to this mower with some steel knives attached to it. One of the colts gets spooked. The mower throws Nicholas Kadori. It actually throws him into the midst of those spinning steel knives, and his right leg gets severed almost all the way up to the groin. He lies there for about a half an hour before someone finally finds him. He is carried into town with him literally cradling his right leg in his arms. And he lives for about a week before he dies. So the great irony is, of course, is that all of this land that he has collected for himself and that he does so well financially off of, the care for that land will ultimately kill him in 1878. But, an interesting story. His son, Simon, the story continues. Simon goes on to run the property. He runs the butchery. He continues to run the farm. And Simon actually sees that he can make more money in the end selling some of this property to the Gettysburg Memorial Association and selling some of the property to these veteran groups who will erect memorials. So the individual choices that these families make after the battle, they're shaping the commemorative landscape and the preserved landscape, which I find interesting in the Kadori.
I wondered if that's where this was going, because, especially as I'm hearing you say he's buying all this land, like, well, at some point, well, of course, it's initially, the War Department and things, but, what will go on to be Gettysburg National Military Park, that's going to come along. And so having all this land will eventually prove financially prosperous. And I mean, obviously George Rose didn't hold out, and nobody knew it was coming, unless I guess you were really savvy and maybe had a guess of where it might be going. But yes, when you were saying that, I wondered if that, eventually there was going to be some profit there.
Right. And, another person who does this so well is Basil Biggs, who is an African-American man who, I think a lot more people are getting familiar with him if they weren't already before. A lot of people might know the story of Abraham Bryan, whose very iconic White House sits, along Cemetery Ridge by Ziegler's Grove, compelling story in and of itself. But Basil Biggs is another just surprising story in that he was born in Maryland. His mother was Black. His father was white. He was bound out at the age of 4. His mother leaves behind about $400 for his education. He never sees any of that money, of course, because it's all taken from him long before he can use it. Eventually, he gets his freedom. He marries a woman who works for a family by the name of Crawford in New Windsor. And the Crawford family will also have a residence, a farm in Gettysburg along Marsh Creek that they will move to and become tenants, renters from during the battle itself. And Basil Biggs works really hard. He proves himself to be a very successful farmer. And after the battle, another African-American man who lives along the Taneytown Road named John Fisher will die. And when he dies, he actually deeds his house over to Basil Biggs along with 10 acres of land. So Biggs ends up moving into John Fisher's house. He eventually does such a good job farming that land that he will buy the Peter Fry House, which is just down the street. It's kind of near the Widow Leister House or Meade's headquarters. That has 30 acres. He'll then eventually acquire the Catherine Gwynn Farm, another significant acreage plot. So he is, making the most out of his situation. And of course, he really comes to the fore when he's living at the Crawford property just after the battle, and the Crawfords had significant damage done to their property during the battle. There were a number of dead bodies, so he has to procure a horse and wagons to bury those bodies. And after he's done, he still has the horses and the wagons, and so he ends up getting a contract to continue exhuming dead bodies and help Samuel Weaver identify some of those bodies and ultimately move them to the National Cemetery. So he is a key figure behind that. He gets paid for doing this work. It's obviously considered very patriotic work, so he's supported by many members of the community. That's where he earns a lot of his money to buy up, this additional acreage. But Basil Biggs happens to come into ownership of the very iconic copse of trees. And he's out there one day working on, in fact, chopping down some of those trees. And this man comes up to him. He says, "Do you know how, valuable those trees are?" And he basically says, "Leave me alone. I need my fence line more than anything else right now." That's the
I know exactly how valuable they are. They're good fence material.
Yes, exactly. But for him, that's the immediate need that he has. And this man turns out to be John Batchelder, of course, one of the first historians and preservationists of the battlefield, who helps to create the park and, the initial interpretation of the park. And so he convinces Basil Biggs to not chop down those copse of trees. And Biggs will eventually sell the copse of trees and his land around what is now known as the Angle for a goodly sum. As well as negotiating for additional money to help pay for damages to his properties from the battle. And so he makes out very well. He becomes a civil rights leader in Gettysburg well after the war years. He creates the African-American Lincoln Cemetery. And so he's another kind of unlikely story where you think, well, of course, all the African-American population, they'd just be destroyed by the battle. A lot of them, fled to Lancaster, the Yellow Hill community, which is near Biglerville today. And some of them certainly did lose their property. They lost everything that they had worked for. Some of them were kidnapped and taken south. I don't deny that at all. But some, like Basil Biggs, were true entrepreneurs, They were in the right place at the right time, and they made the most of the opportunities that were presented to them. And he actually came out, more on top than he ever probably imagined he would before the battle.
Couple follow-up questions to that, and that's an absolutely incredible story. As you're going through all this, I'm thinking, and I'm anticipating that some of our viewers might be thinking or wondering, where do you go for sources on all this? I mean, we're so familiar now, with Civil War medicine. There's all these great resources like the medical and surgical history, or from the military side of things. Of course, you got the official records, and there's all kinds of and pension files in the National Archives. There's all these kind of sources I think people are kind of familiar with. For kind of civilian research, where do you go for that?
So a lot of the collections that I initially accessed are preserved at the Gettysburg National Military Park Library and at the Adams County Historical Society. This Historical Society has a treasure trove of documents pertaining to the history of Gettysburg and the whole county as a whole. And so they have tremendous, accounts of agricultural records, of newspaper clippings, letters. They have census records, all kinds of things that you can find on these families. And then the park also has a tremendous collection organized by farm family, things that have been collected over the years by various historians, including, most recently John Heiser, who just retired. And those files have sources from all over, the traditional agricultural records, census records, kind of official documents, but also documents clipped from soldiers' memoirs where they had specific interactions with families. And those have been transcribed or, clipped and photographed and preserved in these files as well. there are parts of the official records that mention some of these interactions as well. So it's not necessarily just kind of the, the county's own records that we're relying on here, but we're also relying on soldiers, recollections, soldiers, official reports of their interactions with these families. And it kind of reinforces again that these stories are not kind of confined in silos where, we're going to talk about the civilian experience now, and now we're going to talk about the soldier's experience. You can find them all intermeshed with each other, because there really were an unlikely interaction of diverse characters with each other before, during, and after the battle.
Yeah, that's a great point there. And that's also an incredible resource compiled at the Gettysburg National Military Park.
Yes.
I mean, because some of those little nuggets, like from memoirs, I mean, those are just a real pain to find, but sometimes those can be the most rich
Right.
things. So that's amazing that that's all compiled like that.
Right.
I want to go back briefly to something that you kind of mentioned offhand about Basil Biggs, about burying the dead bodies initially on his property and then eventually, kind of being contracted via the National Cemetery. With Gettysburg, and we can probably kind of extrapolate this to other battlefields. If there are dead bodies on, your property, is that the responsibility of the local, the person whose property that is? I mean, I know the army that holds the field kind of helps to some degree, but in some cases they're not going to be there forever, and this is a monumental task. So where does that responsibility fall?
Sure. I think it's a combination of both. If the army who holds the field has the time to bury even just shallow graves, which is what happens in a lot of cases, then bodies are very kind of hastily buried in these mass burial pits. And that's why so many of them are so shallow. That's why you see these horrific images and you read these horrific accounts of hogs and buzzards, just circling the battlefield afterward, unearthing bodies, little hands, sticking up from the soil, being unearthed by hogs, and, bodies, rib cages being ripped out and all things like that. And so then it does fall on the civilians, to try and move these bodies to someplace off of their still fertile farm fields so that they can get back to business. And I think, especially for John Rose, who is the actual farmer of the Rose property, for him, this poses a significant issue. You get into ideas of Victorian notions of the good death and how we should treat dead bodies, even bodies of enemy soldiers. And for him, you have those notions that, maybe soldiers shouldn't necessarily be all tossed in a pit where animals can come and, unearth them 2 days later. But there's also the frank reality of, if he doesn't bury these guys and bury them fast, he's not going to be able to feed his family, when the next winter rolls around, if he can't farm that property. So it really poses kind of a contradiction in ideas, and especially, when these farm families come back and they find, Union soldiers on their property. Of course, they want to try and bury these guys with as much respect as they can, but you can only do so much as an individual or as a couple of people, especially when you're trying to turn around your farm so quickly and get back to work. And that's when the National Cemetery Initiative, that had already been begun earlier in the war, really comes into so much play, is to take care of the practical, necessity of getting rid of these bodies and helping families return to normal, but also, of course, give these soldiers, a proper burial place, with invested political purpose as well.
Mm-hmm. So as we're coming to the end of our time here, I'm wondering if you'd close us with the story of, and I can't remember the family. I want to say it's the Sherfy farm. I just remember one of the things. So I was on that tour that we're kind of riffing off of here, and one of the stories that has most stuck with me is I can't remember the name of the family, but it had to do with this woman baking bread, and she kind of became a myth unto herself. Maybe close with that one.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I just realized, of course, we hadn't talked about any of the women who had experienced, these terrible things too. I believe that's the Josephine Rogers story, is what
Yes.
you're remembering. And she, like so many women in the borough, some of these women will flee with their children, with their families, quite understandably. Some refuse to flee, again, wanting to protect their household. Some have no place to go. That's the case of Catherine Trossel, who lives in the iconic Trossel farm, the barn with the cannonball hole in it now. She's a mother of, I believe, 10 or 11 children. Her husband Abraham is, by all accounts, the town drunk, or one of the town drunks, very abusive. And so she's basically running the farm all by herself. Before the battle, after the battle, her husband gets committed to what they call the lunatic asylum after the battle, and she's left to pick up the pieces. There's, of course, the widow Leister, Lydia Leister, who lives in what becomes George Meade's headquarters, who's living by herself with her 2 young daughters. She has to pick up the pieces of having her very small farm, her house destroyed. And she actually does so. She is one of these entrepreneurs who is able to actually not only rebuild her farm, but also buy additional acreage and expand upon her house after the battle by selling the bones of all the dead horses that had been left there by the battle at 50 cents per 100 pounds. So that's another story, unlikely story of a woman, making out perhaps even better than George Rose.
Not my first thought for a get-rich-quick scheme, sell horse bones.
Yes. I don't know if that would still work, but certainly she was entrepreneurial, and she was no spring chicken when she was doing this. So she was quite an incredible woman, it sounds like. But Josephine Rogers, yeah, she was intriguing because she was one of these women who she lived along the Embattled Road. So again, her house is right in the middle of July 2nd, July 3rd Confederate attacks. And she refuses to leave. She's warned numerous times by soldiers, you got to get out of here. There's a battle coming. You're going to be killed. And she says, nope, I'm going to stay in my house. And not only does she do that, she decides she is going to help bake bread for some of the soldiers. So again, you have kind of the iconic, Jenny Wade type situation going on here. So she's in her house baking bread for soldiers. She befriends a bunch of men from a Massachusetts regiment who took up a post around her house, I believe on July 2nd. And she bakes bread for them. She helps take care of them, nurses some of them as well who are wounded. And she's one of these instances where the relationship between the soldiers and the civilians continues, not only after the battle, but after the war, because this Massachusetts regiment, the veterans of that unit who had fought at Gettysburg, when they come back in the late 19th century to dedicate their monument, it's the site of where, they had been, where her house was during the battle. They are still in contact with Josephine Rogers. They find her, they write her letters, they say, please, will you attend our dedication of our monument? It wouldn't be right without you. She says, okay, I'll be there. They come out, they have this dedication. They actually have her come out and kind of take the podium during the commemoration. They talk about her work, their, relationship with her during the battle and how it's continued afterwards. And then, in honor of her baking bread service, they drag her bake oven out into the yard by the monument, and they take a picture of her standing in front of the bake oven with the monument in the background. And that goes into kind of the permanent collective memory of that unit. And so when you go to the Park Library, I believe is where I found this story, and you look up information on the Rogers family, you see that iconic photo of Josephine Rogers standing by her bake oven with this Massachusetts monument in the background, and the veterans, of course, surrounding her, which is really an amazing story, again, to think about, that these unlikely relationships that forged during the battle that continue afterwards. And again, civilians helping to shape the commemorative landscape after the battle and after the war in surprising ways.
Absolutely, no joke there. I just love that story,
Yeah.
and the ways in which these people from kind of all corners of the nation build these unlikely friendships and that endure well beyond the aftermath of a battle. And thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing all of these just incredible stories. And I know that we really just kind of scratched the surface here. I mean, there's so much. So who knows if there's enough popular demand, maybe we'll do a part two
Or two.
of
Yes.
this sometime. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. If you like the video, consider giving us a like, or perhaps share the video, share it with some of your friends, send it to someone who you know will enjoy it, help spread the word. And if you really, really liked it, maybe you'd consider becoming a member to the Museum of Civil War Medicine. That would mean the world to us, or consider giving a donation to help continue our mission, to kind of keep these stories alive, stories of medical care, of civilians, and all that sort of thing. So thank you again for watching. Thank you, Ashley, for being with us today.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'll say it's an interesting kind of full circle between me and John, our relationship. I remember numerous times at the Civil War Institute conference before I started working for CWI, attending the conference, either just as, you know, an interested historian or as a speaker. And John would get up to the microphone and announce his presence. I'm John Lustrea from Chicago, Illinois, and his iconic purple hooded sweatshirt when he was still in school. And so I've known John for quite some time, first just by his association with asking really great questions at all of the main lecture sessions that were held in the college ballroom, but then also as a historian and colleague and friend in the field. So it's always interesting to see how these things come full circle. And I appreciate you giving me a chance to share some of these stories today.
Absolutely. Well, I'm happy to keep asking good questions here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Till next time, friends, this is John and Ashley signing off.